Well, what do you know? It's actually a good show. Considering the total mess that was the last season of Game of Thrones, I had low expectations for the House of the Dragon. Even though the show doesn't have the same creative team as Game of Thrones, there's always a chance that the funk of the last two seasons would rub off on Ryan Condal. Now, I can't say that won't eventually happen, I'm only one episode in, but at least in this pilot episode, feels like season 4 of Game of Thrones. It's good. The show is set nearly 150 years before the events of Game of Thrones. It follows House Targaryen in their civil war known as the Dance of Dragons. George R. R. Martin detailed these events in several books, including Fire and Blood, a book he was, and apparently still is writing instead of finishing A Song of Ice and Fire. So, since we're not going to get the end to that series, why not get something else that's actually finished? The first episode sets up the stakes. When King Jaehaerys' heir dies, he sets out to pick a new one to prevent a civil war. There were several serious claims, but only two really considered: his eldest grandchild Rhaenys, or his oldest male grandchild Viserys. He chose Viserys, setting in motion the very civil war he'd hoped to avoid. The show then jumps a decade to introduce Viserys' daughter Rhaenyra and his brother Daemon. After a decade of reigning, Viserys is still without a proper male heir. His wife Aemma is with child and due soon. Viserys hopes it's a boy, much to his current heir Daemon's annoyance. Rhaenyra, despite being the eldest child, isn't considered because she's a girl. Condal and Martin do a great job of setting up all the factions. You already know Daemon, the current commander of the City Watch, is angling for the Iron Throne. That Rhaenys and her husband Corlys Velaryon are looking to make a claim, if not for Rhaenys, then for their son Laenor. Then there's Otto Hightower, the Hand of the King, clearly making his own moves. And finally Rhaenyra, who pretends not to be interested in the crown but really is. You can even begin to see where alliances will be formed and who might betray who. There's also that thing about Targaryen incest, which Daemon and Rhaenyra toy with in this episode. The show also deals with the sexism of the medieval age, not just with women not being allowed to inherit the crown, but also the trials of pregnancy. Queen Aemma goes into labor in the middle of the tournament for their soon-to-be son, and the show cuts between the violence of the tourney and Aemma's agony as the baby hasn't turned and appears both will die. The Maester presents Viserys with a choice. He can allow the Maester to perform a cesarean, or let the gods decide. The way I took it was that Aemma was doomed either way. She's going to die, but perhaps the baby can be saved. However, it seems like everyone else took it that Viserys had to choose between Aemma or the baby, and as much as he loves his wife, he really wants an heir, so he allows a C-section, but doesn't tell Aemma, so she's horrified when the Maester comes at her with a knife. As she's cut open with blood going everywhere, it's intercut with scenes of knights getting axes to the face. It's a powerful scene because they don't try to hide how grotesque and bloody this would have been at the time, and because it shows women's status at the time, which was something Game of Thrones did as well that ironically pissed off the same feminists now praising this scene. Unfortunately for Viserys, his choice backfires. Aemma dies, and so does his son Balon. As this happens, Daemon gets his ass kicked by Criston Cole, a Dornish knight who catches Rhaenyra's eye. After the tourney and the news of the queen and prince's deaths, King's Council meets to talk about the succession. They fear Daemon coming to power, particularly Otto, who thinks that Daemon might become a tyrant. He and the Maester suggest naming Rhaenyra as the heir, but this is rejected due to her being a girl. Viserys eventually loses it over them bickering about this right after he just lost his wife and son. Unknown to them, Daemon is watching as this goes down. He takes his city watch to a brothel where he celebrates his nephew's death, titling him the heir for a day. This gets back to Otto, who informs Viserys, who then banishes his brother from King's Landing. He then informs Rhaenyra that she will be his heir, and we get this little extra bit of info that ties to Game of Thrones, namely that each heir is told about the Song of Ice and Fire, the dream Aegon I had of the coming attack of the White Walkers. Viserys emphasizes how important it is to have a Targaryen on the throne, because Dragonfire and Valyrian steel. The episode ends with people pledging their loyalty to Rhaenyra as Daemon flies off on his dragon with his favorite hoe. It's a solid start to the series. There were some questionable VFX shots with the dragons, but nothing too serious. I'm curious about the sets though, because many of them were seen in Game of Thrones, and I wonder how many of those are the original sets and how many they have to rebuild. The show looks awesome though. The costuming is perfect, except for the silver wigs. I know nobody wants to dye their hair white or silver, but some of them wigs just ain't working. Now, I'm not that familiar with the Targaryen lore. I'm not opposed to knowing it, but I'm also not going to give Martin any more of my money until he finishes his main story. So I had to check this out in the wikis for the series to see what had actually been changed. Let's get the obvious change out of the way. This is Corlys Velaryon, and this is what he looks like in the show. For some inexplicable reason, they decided to race swap the character. The change alone is weird because there's no actual reason to do this, but it's made weirder by Corlys being the only one, so far, who's been race swapped, making him the sole black nobleman in the show, And despite these people holding very traditional medieval values, they apparently have no problem with the black dude at court. This makes even less sense considering that we've already seen what Westeros looks like in Game of Thrones, and we know who people this continent. There's no one on the continent who looks like this, and no explanation is given for how all the Valyrian lines we've seen so far are white, but this one random dude is black. And I'm sure someone will make the argument that it's fantasy, so people can be any race, but that's not how fantasy works. Just because you have magic and dragons doesn't mean you can do anything. And a general rule of thumb when it comes to science fiction and fantasy is that unless it's otherwise stated, the rules of these fictional worlds match our own, be it physics, nature, or culture. Most people live in homogeneous cultures, and until recently, it was difficult to travel great distances quickly, which resulted in just a handful of multi-ethnic centers in the world, meaning it's unlikely to find Africans in the middle of northwestern Europe in the 9th century. The same rule would apply to Westeros, meaning it makes no sense for Corlys to be black. There were also other changes, specifically with Rhaenyra's age. She's 8 in the books when she becomes the heir. Alicent Hightower and Rhaenyra's friendship. In the book, they're 10 years apart and don't like each other, along with some general adjustments to the timeline. Nothing too severe or lore-breaking, but it will result in some events and possibly relationships being changed. Overall, I'm looking forward to see where this goes. However, I haven't forgotten Game of Thrones or Kenobi. I know this can turn bad fast, so my hopes are tempered. That way I don't get caught off guard. So now, your move, Amazon. Can you make a show as good as this one? Because they did the whole strong woman thing without having Rhaenys, Emma, or Rhaenyra ever lift a finger. Can you rise to the challenge, or are you going to be the GoBots to HBO's Transformers? But what do I know? I'm just some guy.